Welcome back, vintage camera lovers, to another serving of gear nostalgia, and today I'm trying out one of my most desired lenses from my teenage years that today is a perfect introduction for anyone to vintage optics. It's the Nikkor 50mm f1.4 AIS, an almost ubiquitous standard lens for Nikon's upmarket 35mm film SLRs in the 80s, and one that not only subsequently worked on Nikon DSLRs, but which can be adapted to almost any mirrorless camera from almost any brand. Mount it on a modern camera and you'll enjoy all manner of focusing assistance, video capabilities and even stabilization that we could only dream of 40 years ago. In this review, I'll show you what the lens can do and why it's still desirable over 4 decades after it first came out. The 1.4 AIS was introduced in 1981, and it was around that time that I fell in love with it, and if I'm being honest, the entire Nikkor lens catalogue. I just loved the signature look and feel of these early to mid 1980s lenses, compact and superbly built, but sadly way out of reach for this teen of the time. As I graduated from 110 cameras to my dad's Praktica MTL3 with its meagre 52.8 lens, I could only look on in envy at the Nikon F3 on shop shelves, always sporting a faster 50, and while the more common 1.8 was still way brighter than mine, it was the higher end 1.4 that I truly aspired to. In the wise words of Wayne Campbell, it will be mine. Oh yes, it will be mine. Well, dear viewer, let me tell you that dreams can come true, although this particular one took 4 decades to realise. To be honest, I wasn't actively chasing this particular lens, but it was always in the back of my mind, and during a recent trip to Tokyo, I was reminded of its allure. I was showing fellow YouTuber Richard Wong and filmmaker Piotr Kwasnik around a wonderful used camera store in Akihabara called Second Base, when a row of vintage lenses called out to me. I was actually looking for a pancake alternative to the recently launched Lumix 26mm f8, and I was initially drawn to the Nikkor 45mm 2.8, but then I noticed a 51.4 at a bargain 18,700 yen, which at 2024 exchange rates worked out about $120 or £90. I ended up buying both lenses, as well as an F to L mount adapter for less than $275 or £215 in total, and if you'd like to see more of our evening browsing the used and new camera stores of Akihabara, check out Richard's video on his channel. I may have bagged a bargain in Japan, but this lens can generally be found for around $100 to $200 or pounds on the used market, depending on condition. So let's see what makes it special. First things first, the Nikkor 1.4 AIS may have been introduced in 1981, but its popularity saw it in production until 2005, an impressive 24 years during which around 750,000 units were made. As such, there's a lot of them out there, so you shouldn't have any difficulty tracking one down. But how vintage will it actually be? According to Roland Vink's hugely comprehensive and invaluable photosynthesis website, this lens started production with serial number 5100001 in 1981 and ended at around 5858632 in 2005. A subsequent smaller run started in 2006 with serial number 6000001 producing around 25,000 more lenses until this model was officially discontinued in 2020. Now, given mine has a serial number of 5844848, it was made towards the end of its first production life in the early 2000s, but all share the same optical and mechanical design introed in the early 80s, itself actually based on a pre-AI version dating from 1976. So while my own lens is actually closer to 20 rather than 40 to 50 years old, it's still a vintage classic. Now, if you're used to using modern lenses, the first thing that's going to strike you about models from this era are their compact dimensions. As manual focus lenses, there's no need to accommodate autofocus motors, and the approaches to optical construction were also simpler without the obsession for perfection that we have today. Measuring 60mm in diameter and 40mm long, the 1.4 is comfortably smaller than any modern standard lens of this aperture, in fact more akin in size to a budget 1.8. For comparison, here's the Nikkor 1.4 on a Lumix S5 II body, including an adapter which almost doubles its length. And now for the Lumix S 50mm 1.8, a modern alternative for L mount with a slightly dimmer aperture but a considerably larger barrel. The difference is quite striking, and if I had a modern 1.4 to match the apertures, it'd be even bigger. But the second thing that strikes you is the actual feel of the lens in your hands. As soon as you pick it up, it feels a world apart from the typical plastic construction of modern lenses. Now, I have nothing against the materials used today, but there is an undeniable solidity to these all-metal lens barrels from the 80s that just feel classier to me, certainly different to modern lenses. Weighing 250 grams on my scales, it's lighter than some 50s and heavier than others, but packed into its small barrel gives it a reassuring density that's rare on modern lenses. As I show you around the lens, also look at the markings, not painted directly onto the barrel, but first etched in before being filled with paint. In particular, note the coloured aperture markings, with the smallest setting in orange indicating this is an AIS lens as opposed to earlier AI or non-AI versions which used blue for their smallest aperture value. In fact, vintage Nikkor fans will know there's a whole raft of clues to identify each type and era of lens, so I'm going to mention a few of them here. Starting at the mount, you'll see a metal bayonet held in place by 3 crosshead screws, compared to more screws on earlier versions. 2 further AIS clues here are the milled notch at around 9 o'clock on the flat mount surface here, and the protruding tab close to the rear element, both used to identify the lens type to the body. You may also notice the rear of the outer metal barrel is mostly flush with the silver flat plate, apart from a small ridged arc that protrudes a little further out. This is actually part of the aperture ring, and it's used to push a lever on a compatible body to indicate the aperture value. It's present on both AIS and earlier AI lenses, and it may be possible to convert even older non-AI lenses by actually milling down the required section to create a ridge. Also note the small spring-loaded stop-down lever that mechanically adjusts the actual aperture diaphragm itself when again mounted on a compatible body. This allows the lens to be used in program and shutter priority modes on those bodies that support it, and I believe it was introduced on AI lenses. Also see how the diaphragm employs 7 very straight blades as opposed to the more rounded blades on modern lenses. This in turn will mean more angular bokeh blobs, which I'll show in a moment, but also very sharply defined diffraction spikes. Aperture control, or at least feedback on the selected value, was a big part of Nikon's lens designs, with new models attempting to find better ways of performing it while maintaining as much backwards compatibility as possible with older bodies. One of the most obvious throwbacks is the silver metal semicircle screwed into the aperture ring with a slot cut out in the middle. These prongs would line up with a pin on older bodies to indicate the selected aperture value. Notice the 2 holes or nostrils on either side of my lens, another indicator of an AIS or AI model, as earlier non-AI versions were solid here. I believe these were introduced to allow more light to shine onto the tiny row of aperture numbers closest to the mount. These in turn were actually visible in a small window through the viewfinder of compatible SLRs, neatly showing the aperture value during composition. As for the actual operation, there's just 2 controls, starting with the aperture ring that runs between f1.4 and f16 in 1-stop increments with satisfying clicks between each. Again, notice the colour coding of the smaller values, which correspond with a depth of field scale on the silver ring alongside. This ring also has a small red dot to indicate where you should readjust the lens focus when shooting in infrared. Which brings me to the manual focusing ring, arguably the best part of a vintage Nikkor lens from this era. The fairly short throw of about 130 degrees takes you from infinity to the closest marked focusing distance of 45 centimeters or 1.5 feet, with hard stops at each end. Distances in feet are marked in yellow and in white for meters. But the special part is how this feels, silky smooth and perfectly damped, allowing quick racking at one moment before you zero in with absolute precision. And remember, it's not motor assisted like a modern lens, it's directly extending the barrel and moving elements inside. I'm not exaggerating when I say I think this is one of the best manual focusing rings that I've used on any lens, new or old, and I just adore it. While this lens was designed to be focused using the optical viewfinder on a Nikon F-mount film SLR, the experience is transformed by live view on a more recent Nikon DSLR or adapted to a mirrorless camera where you can exploit all manner of manual focusing assistance tools, not to mention capturing photos or video. I bought a Nikon F to L mount adapter, allowing me to use this lens on a full-frame Panasonic Lumix S camera. Since the lens has no electrical connections nor autofocus, there's no need for a more sophisticated adapter, just one that literally positions the lens outwards at the correct distance from the focal plane. To optimize any stabilization you might have within your camera, you'll need to enter the lens focal length manually, but on the S5 II you can make a custom preset and select it as you power up. This focal length is also then stored in the image EXIF data, but only compatible Nikon bodies will actually report the selected aperture value. Since the diaphragm is directly operated by the aperture ring though, it is possible to manually select any value with this ring, with most cameras then happily metering the incoming light and automatically adjusting their shutter speeds or ISO sensitivities in the appropriate modes. I mostly used aperture priority on my Lumix S5 II with the Nikkor lens and found it delivered a very usable semi-automatic experience. Sure, the camera had absolutely no idea what actual aperture value I'd selected, but it could measure the resulting light and automatically set a shutter speed or ISO to match. As for focusing, I set the body to manual focus and enabled focus peaking, which outlines focused edges with a selection of colours. If you're shooting lower resolution photo or video, peaking can be sufficiently accurate when viewing the whole image, but for the best results, especially if you're shooting at higher resolutions, I'd recommend magnifying a portion of the image to nail your focus. The combination of magnification and peaking, not to mention IBIS, keeping the image nice and steady as you focus it, makes vintage lenses an absolute joy to use today, and very practical for those who are mostly used to modern autofocus systems. So, it looks and feels good, it's easy to focus on modern bodies, but how does a 40-year-old optical design measure up today? Let's find out by putting the lens through my usual tests, although do remember that my results are indicative of my particular sample, and like all lenses, especially older used ones, there can be variations. Oh, and it's also interesting to remember that you're going to be looking at pure optical quality alone here without any profiles or digital corrections applied. And that's part of the appeal of using vintage lenses originally designed for film cameras. So let's start with my distant landscape scene with Brighton Pier angled so that details run into the corners. I took this with the Lumix S5 II using peaking and magnified assistance to focus the lens. You're looking at the Nikkor 50mm 1.4 AIS wide open at 1.4, and if we take a closer look in the middle, you'll see the finest details have become a little soft. There's reduced contrast and also some evidence of chromatic aberrations. Now this is all due to pretty well documented spherical aberrations for this lens, so it's not unexpected, but look what happens when you close the aperture just one stop to f2. The contrast and sharpness both enjoy a substantial boost, while most of those colour artifacts have been eliminated. As I close the aperture further, the quality gradually improves, and between f5.6 and f8 is looking very sharp in the middle. Now let's return to the 1.4 version before heading out to the far corners, where you'll see the image quality is marred by softness, along with darkening due to vignetting. Closing to f2 lifts some of that corner darkening, with the overall quality gradually improving as the aperture is closed further. I'd say it's looking pretty good at f5.6, but there's further benefits to sharpness in the corners to be had right up to f11. Out of curiosity, I thought it'd be interesting to compare the Nikkor 50 1.4 AIS against a more modern 50mm lens. Now since I'm testing with a Lumix body, I've opted for the Lumix S 50mm 1.8, a substantially larger lens with autofocus that costs around $400 or pounds. Panasonic and Sigma also make premium f1.4 50s, but they're much larger, heavier and more expensive, and besides I didn't have either of those to hand, so the 1.8 will have to do here. So now you're looking at close-ups of the middle from both lenses here at their maximum respective apertures, 1.4 for the old Nikkor on the left and 1.8 for the Lumix on the right, where the latter is notably sharper right out the gate. As I close their apertures, the Nikkor on the left gradually improves, while the Lumix on the right remains fairly consistent in the middle, and by the time both lenses are at f8, the vintage lens has almost caught up. Switching to their corners and gradually closing the apertures shows both lenses benefiting, but again the modern lens on the right is outperforming the vintage one on the left. Of course this shouldn't come as any surprise given the Lumix S50 1.8 enjoys 40 years of optical advances over the vintage Nikkor, not to mention digital profiles on its side, but I do think it's useful to show the differences under a variety of conditions so that you know the pros and cons of older lenses. So let's now move on to a portrait shot with the Nikkor 50 wide open again at f1.4, and when viewing the whole image you can see a nice balance of detail on my face with attractive blurring behind me. Taking a closer look reveals the same aberrations we saw earlier on the landscape scene at 1.4, but here with a human subject it's more forgiving, and some may actually prefer the look over an often clinical modern lens. Given that I'm the subject, I'm reluctant to use the word dreamy, but you know what I mean. That said, if you close the aperture just one stop to f2, you'll again enjoy a decent boost in detail and contrast without losing too much of the bokeh behind me. Obviously some of those blobs have now taken on a geometric shape, but there's still decent separation to be had. Let's now return to the 1.4 version on the left and compare it to the Lumix S 50mm 1.8 on the right, both wide open, where you'll see crisper details from the newer lens. But that's not always a desirable thing on a portrait. I'll now switch the Nikkor sample on the left for the f2 version, which again shows worthwhile improvements without becoming too unforgiving. The modern lens is sharper, but I do like the look of the older one here. Next for bokeh blobs, from the closest focusing distance of the Nikkor 50, where f1.4 you'll notice the blobs become elongated towards the edges. But look closely and you'll see that they're avoiding textures within, and there's also minimal outlining too, at least in this example. I'd say overall it's an attractive result. Close the aperture by just one stop though, and you'll immediately see the impact of the 7-bladed diaphragm system, with those very straight blades transforming those blobs into well-defined heptagons, mostly uniform in size and shape. As I gradually close the aperture down, this style of rendering really stands out as a difference with the more rounded blades of modern lenses, and is something that you're either going to love or hate, but it's certainly a distinct visual style and I'm quite fond of the difference. Let's now put the vintage Nikkor on the left and the modern Lumix lens on the right, both wide open at 1.4 and 1.8 respectively. Here you'll see the blobs on the Lumix on the right are more rounded, but the rendering style is actually quite similar. As I close their apertures though, the difference between the shape of their diaphragm systems becomes immediately apparent. And while you can spot the shape of the Lumix diaphragm on the right, it manages to stay mostly circular, while the Nikkor unashamedly embraces the sharp geometry. This is going to be a major difference between new and old lenses, so do you have a preference? Another way to illustrate and embrace the bokeh of a vintage lens is for video. In this first clip, I'll rack focus from infinity to the closest distance with the aperture wide open at f1.4, where you'll see the elongated blobs steadily grow. But now here's how it looks closed just one stop to f2, where the heptagon shapes gradually emerge in quite a stylish way. I grew fond of this effect and filmed a bunch of examples outside around Brighton at dusk. I really like the style of the background rendering, even if the bokeh blobs do look a little sharply outlined at times. These clips were all filmed at the maximum aperture, so no heptagons to see here, but with the smooth manual focusing ring, it's easy to pull focus from one distance to another. These clips were also all handheld using body-based stabilization only. It's crazy to consider a lens designed for use on a film SLR in the 80s is now being used 40 years later to film 4K video on a camera with built-in stabilization and an electronic viewfinder or flip-out screen with manual focusing assistance. And now it's time for my verdict, during which I'll share more photos taken with the lens on an S5 II body. The Nikkor 50mm f1.4 AIS was one of the most desirable standard lenses when it came out in 1981, and an ideal choice for anyone who wants to explore vintage optics today. Of course, it's not going to be as crisp as a modern lens, especially with the aperture wide open or if you're examining the far corners, but with the aperture closed to even just one stop, the quality becomes very respectable in the middle, and those extreme portions sharpen up nicely as you close the aperture further. But like all vintage lenses, you're choosing it more for its character, both optical and physical. With the aperture wide open, the image may be a little soft, but it can lend an almost dreamy look to portraits while delivering attractive bokeh and rendering. Meanwhile, at any other aperture setting, the diaphragm system will turn those bokeh blobs into defined heptagons, and as the aperture becomes smaller, any point sources of light will enjoy 14 sharp spikes. Either of these will give it a different look to modern lenses, whether capturing photos or video, and remember, it's pure optical performance without any digital correction. But for me, best of all is the design and build quality. The compact all-metal barrel looks and feels great in your hands, smaller than most modern lenses of this or even smaller apertures, complemented by classy etched characters and one of the smoothest manual focusing rings that I've had the pleasure of using. It's controls like these that remind me that manual focusing can actually be a joy rather than a hindrance, especially combined with the assistance of a modern body. Every time I pick this lens up, I want to shoot with it, which really says it all. I personally think every photographer benefits from having at least one vintage lens in their collection, and a nice bright 50 is the perfect starting point. The beauty of adapting them to mirrorless is being able to choose from almost any brand, with excellent and often more affordable alternatives available from Canon, Pentax and Olympus, to name but three. The Nikkor may be one of the more expensive options, but I personally chose it for its quality, the fact that I've wanted one since childhood, and the chance for it to also perform double duty on both a modern mirrorless camera and mounted on an f3 film body should I ever find one at a decent price. And that's the end of this review. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be making a separate video all about the Nikkor 45mm 2.8 pancake, but do let me know if you'd like me to review any other vintage lenses in the future, and also how you'd like them to be tested. Should I be comparing them against modern optics, or perhaps pairing them with the film cameras of the same era that they were designed for, or maybe a bit of both? Let me know in the comments along with your favourite old lenses. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.